She gave him the best years of her life, her 20s, her dreams, her complete and unwavering trust. And every single morning for 16 years, she woke up beside a man she thought she knew, while he kept a secret so enormous it would eventually swallow her whole. This is not a story about love. This is a story about the person love can make you blind to. Think about the person you trust most in this world, the one you would stake everything on, the one whose face you have memorized in 100 different expressions of joy, of frustration, of laughter across a dinner table. Now imagine waking up one ordinary morning and discovering that person, that face, that voice, that life you built together, was a carefully constructed performance designed to keep you looking the other way, not for a few weeks, not for a year, but for the entirety of your adult life. Imagine realizing that the man you defended at every dinner party, the man whose name you took, the man whose children you carried and raised and loved with everything inside you, was standing in rooms you never knew existed, making decisions so dark they would have destroyed you if you'd known sooner. This is the story of Danielle, and the man she knew as Craig, and the secret buried beneath 17 years of Sunday church services, family dinners, soccer games, and bedtime prayers. A secret that would ultimately consume everything and leave an entire community asking one question that nobody could answer. How do you look at a man every single day and never see what he actually is? Before we go any further, before we walk into the life that Danielle believed she was living, here are the questions this story is going to make you sit with. Where were you watching from when the people around you changed? How many times have you been in a room with someone and accepted their explanation simply because they gave it with confidence? And perhaps most importantly, if the warning signs were there, written plainly in the years before everything collapsed, would you have recognized them, or would you have done exactly what Danielle did, trusted, believed, stayed? We are going to go through this story from the very beginning, from the night Danielle first saw Craig across a crowded room at a college Bible study meeting in Illinois, to the February night in 2017 when police surrounded her home in the small town of Erie, weapons drawn, asking questions about a couple named Larry and Ruth that Danielle had believed were simply her husband's church friends. We are going to follow the money that Craig was losing. We are going to sit inside the lies he was telling. And we are going to be with Danielle in the exact moment her world stopped making sense forever. There are no easy answers in this story. There is no tidy morale that wraps everything up. There is only the truth, and the truth, as Danielle learned, is sometimes the most violent thing a person can face. And before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand why this story is so devastating, you have to understand who Danielle was before Craig. Because Danielle was not a naive woman, she was not someone who floated through life without paying attention to the world around her. She was sharp. She was grounded. She was the kind of woman her friends described as having both feet firmly on the ground at all times. She came from a solid Midwestern family in Illinois, the kind of place where people knew their neighbors by name, where faith was woven into the fabric of daily life, where a handshake still meant something and a person's word was considered a form of currency. She grew up going to church not because it was expected, but because it genuinely meant something to her. She believed in community. She believed in honesty. She believed with every part of her heart that the world generally reflected what you put into it. When Danielle was in her early 20s, she was still figuring out the shape of her life. She had plans. Real ones. She had a sense of herself. She was the younger sister in a close family, and when her sister invited her to a Bible study gathering at her college one evening, Danielle went the way you go to things at 23, without particular expectation, open to whatever the night might bring. She could not have known that the night was going to bring her Craig, and she certainly could not have known what Craig would one day become. Nobody in that room that evening could have predicted any of it. Craig at the time was everything you would want a young man to be. He was smart, genuinely, noticeably intelligent. He had been the valedictorian of his high school graduating class in 1995 in Erie, Illinois, and he carried that intelligence with a kind of quiet confidence that people found enormously attractive. He wasn't loud about it. He didn't walk into a room demanding to be noticed. He was the type who listened carefully before he spoke, who made people feel heard when they talked to him, who gave the impression that he was always thinking one step ahead. The people who knew him back then used words like kind and trustworthy and solid. A college friend of both Danielle and Craig, a woman named Barbara, remembered years later that Craig had a reputation even then for being, as she put it, very smart and very kind. Those were the two things people said about Craig. Over and over, smart and kind. Their first date was about as wholesome as first dates get. They watched movies together, sitting on a couch with Danielle's sister and her date, laughing at comedies, passing the evening in the easy, uncomplicated way you pass an evening when you're young and the world feels full of possibility. Danielle liked him. It was simple at first, just liking someone, just finding someone easy to be around, just noticing that the hours went by quickly in his presence. They started spending more time together. They talked on the phone late into the night the way people did before texting made everything instant. Craig was attentive. He remembered things she told him. He showed up when he said he would. For a woman who valued reliability, who had been raised to believe that consistency was a form of love, Craig was checking every single box. What Danielle did not know, what she would not learn until years into their marriage, was that even in those early days, Craig was already carrying something he had never told her. Early in their relationship, before they had committed to a life together, Craig admitted something to Danielle that would have sent most women walking out the door. He confessed to having had a sexual encounter with a man in a public restroom. It was the kind of confession that hangs in the air after it's spoken, that changes the temperature of the room, that forces the person hearing it to make a decision about what they believe and what they can accept. A marriage counselor, when Danielle sought guidance, told her plainly, "Leave." The professional advice was clear and unambiguous. But Danielle was not a woman who gave up easily. She was not someone who turned away from people when things became difficult. She believed in working through hard things. She believed in commitment. And she believed, with the full weight of her faith, that love was a choice you kept making even when it cost you something. So she stayed. And a few months later, she found out she was pregnant with their first child, a daughter they would name Grace.
The pregnancy changed everything and nothing at the same time. It gave Danielle a reason to look forward. It gave Craig what appeared to be a new sense of purpose. They married and began building the life that would come to define the next 17 years. They moved into a home in Erie, Illinois, a small town of just over 1,600 people. The kind of town where everybody knows which car belongs in which driveway, where news travels fast, where trust between neighbors is simply assumed. And in Erie, Craig and Danielle were considered a cornerstone family. He had launched a financial advising business, Shipper Financial Services, and it appeared to be doing well. They were respected, they were liked, they were, by every visible measure, exactly what a family is supposed to look like. Over the next several years, they had 6 children together. 6. The house filled up with noise and laundry and homework and the particular controlled chaos of a large family. Moving through its days, Danielle ran the household. She was the steady center of it, the one who knew every child's schedule, who kept the emotional temperature of the family regulated, who made sure dinner was on the table and lunches were packed and nobody felt overlooked. Craig, for his part, played the role of the provider. His business was growing, at least as far as Danielle could see. He was busy, always busy. He had clients to meet, properties to look at, paperwork to file. As his business expanded, he began buying rental properties, renovating them, managing tenants, acquiring more. Danielle trusted that this was all part of building something for their family. She had no reason to question it. He was her husband. He was the father of her 6 children. He was the man who sat in the church pew beside her every Sunday morning, with their children lined up between them like a row of blessings. But Craig was drifting, slowly, imperceptibly, in the way that a person drifts when they are carrying something too heavy to manage alone. He began spending more and more time in his first-floor home office. The door closed, the hours stretching later and later into the night. He started sleeping downstairs regularly, telling Danielle it was simply because he was working late and didn't want to wake her. Danielle didn't love this arrangement. Any wife would notice the absence of her husband in the bed beside her, would feel the shift in intimacy, would wonder about the closed door and the late hours, but she accepted it, because Craig had an explanation for everything. That was one of his most disarming qualities. He always had an explanation, always delivered it calmly, always made it sound entirely reasonable. And so Danielle accepted the closed door. She accepted the late nights. She accepted the distance, because she had been accepting it in small increments for so long that each new increment felt like barely anything at all. Here is where the story shifts. Here is where, in hindsight, the pieces begin to show themselves, not as warnings, because none of them felt like warnings at the time, but as a pattern that was quietly assembling itself beneath the surface of an ordinary life. In the mid-2010s, Craig had come across a couple from his church, a couple he had known for some time, whose son he had actually gone to school with. Their names, in this story, we'll call Larry and Ruth Van Osten. Larry and Ruth were older, in their 60s, respected members of their community, deeply faithful, the kind of people who showed up early to everything and stayed late to help clean up. They had recently come into a substantial sum of money, and Craig, who presented himself as a capable financial advisor with years of experience behind him, approached them about becoming his clients. He gave them his pitch. He was polished. He was persuasive. He sat across from them in a meeting and spoke with the measured, confident tone of a man who clearly knew what he was doing. Larry and Ruth listened to everything Craig had to say. They were polite about it. They were kind about it. But in the end, they declined. They told him he seemed to be doing well, but that they felt he was still in the early phase of his career, and they preferred to work with someone who had more years behind them. It was a gentle rejection, a reasonable one, the kind that happens in business every day without consequence. Craig thanked them and left, and on the outside, that was the end of it. To church friends who decided not to become clients, nothing more. But inside Craig, something had been set in motion that would not stop. Because what Larry and Ruth did not know, what Danielle did not know, what almost nobody in Erie knew, was that Craig's financial advising business was not what it appeared to be. The success he had been projecting for years was largely an illusion. He was hemorrhaging money. He was buried in debt that had been accumulating slowly, silently, like water rising in a room with no windows. And it wasn't just business debt. Craig had been allegedly embezzling funds from his own clients for some time, stealing money from family members, and had reportedly taken out loans against his own parents' house by forging documents, all in an effort to keep the facade of a thriving business from collapsing under its own weight. The rental properties he had been acquiring were not a sign of growth. They were a desperate attempt to generate cash that would patch the holes in a boat that was already sinking. He was not a financial advisor building wealth for his family. He was a man running as fast as he could in one direction while quietly dismantling everything behind him. And Danielle knew none of it. None. She was living inside a version of their life that Craig had carefully constructed and maintained, showing her what he wanted her to see, keeping the rest locked behind a door she had no idea existed. The bills that should have alarmed her were intercepted or explained away. The conversations that should have happened never happened. The questions she might have asked were answered before she could fully form them. Craig was, if nothing else, extremely good at managing the flow of information. He had been doing it for years. He had been doing it since the very beginning of their marriage. In fact, when the first confession and the closed door office and the late nights were all part of the same long performance, a performance that was now, in the mid-2010s, approaching its final act, because when you run from debt long enough, eventually the debt stops running and starts waiting, and Craig was running out of places to go. By 2015, Craig had begun planning something, not repairing what he had broken, not confessing to Danielle and trying to find a legitimate way through the crisis, not reaching out for help. He had decided, with the calculated mind of a man who had always believed he was the smartest person in the room, that there was another option, and the other option involved Larry and Ruth Van Osten, the people who had said no, the people who had the money he desperately needed, the people who trusted him because they knew him from church, because their son had gone to school with him, because in Erie, Illinois, in a congregation where everyone looked out for everyone else, the idea that someone from your own pew could do what Craig was planning to do was simply unthinkable. That's what he was counting on, the unthinkable. It is the fall of 2016, and Danielle is living her life. She is managing a household of 8 people. She is raising 6 children, ranging from young teenagers to smaller kids who still need help with their homework and their nighttime routines. She is doing what she has always done, holding the center of a family together with both hands, while her husband moves in and out of their lives like weather, present for dinners and weekend moments and the kinds of occasions that get photographed, absent for the hours in between. She is not perfectly happy. What wife with 6 children and a distant husband is perfectly happy? But she is not alarmed. She is not looking for anything. She trusts Craig. She has always trusted Craig. That trust is so foundational to how she operates that questioning. It would feel like questioning the floor beneath her feet. And then something strange happens. One evening in late 2016, one of Danielle and Craig's children notices something odd. A car parked near their house that the child doesn't recognize, sitting in the street with the engine running, watching. The child mentions it to Danielle. Danielle notes it and files it away without too much concern. Strange cars appear on residential streets all the time. It probably means nothing, but the detail stays with her. The way small details sometimes stay with you without your knowing why. Around the same time, Craig sends a text message to their teenage daughter, Grace. He asks her to take the handle of a sledgehammer and wrap it in black electrical tape. It is an odd request. Grace thinks it's weird. She says as much in interviews years later. But she does it because Craig tells her there will be a special treat in it for her if she does a good job. She wraps the handle. She hands it over. And she thinks nothing more of it. Because why would she? He is her father. Fathers sometimes need tools wrapped. It is just a slightly unusual request on an otherwise ordinary afternoon. It is February 7, 2017. It is not yet 4 o'clock in the morning. Erie, Illinois is dark and cold and completely still. Larry and Ruth Van Osten are asleep in their home, the way they have been every night for decades, the way they fully expected to be that night, to people in their 60s, deeply faithful, respected in their community, surrounded by the familiar objects of a life well lived. And then Craig Shipper breaks into their home. He uses the sledgehammer, the one his own daughter wrapped with electrical tape, not knowing what it was for. He comes through the door in the pre-dawn darkness, and he comes armed with a taser, with duct tape, with handcuffs, and he takes this couple. He covers their mouths and their eyes with tape. He restrains their hands. He does not speak to them in his own voice. He uses a voice distorter, a device specifically designed to make him unrecognizable. And somewhere in those first horrifying moments, with Larry and Ruth Van Osten bound and terrified in their own home in the middle of the night, Craig says something through that distorter that no one who has heard it has ever been able to forget. He asks them, "Where is your God now?" Think about what that sentence means in the context of this story. This is a man who has attended church regularly for years, a man whose wife and children sat beside him in those same pews every Sunday, a man who was known in that congregation as a pillar. And in the darkest, most violent moment of his criminal act, the first thing he chooses to say to an elderly couple he is terrorizing, in their own home, people he knew from that same church, is a mockery of the faith that held all of their lives together. It tells you something about who Craig actually was. It tells you something about the contempt that had been living beneath the composed, capable, church-going surface all along. The words, "Where is your God now?" were not improvised in a moment of panic. They were chosen. That was a man speaking who had spent a long time thinking about what he was doing and what he wanted to say while he was doing it. Craig drove Larry and Ruth to a property he owned, a rental home in Geneseo, Illinois, a town roughly 30 miles from Erie. He had prepared this place. There was a room set up with security cameras and a microphone that he could monitor from a separate room. Watching the couple he had imprisoned the way a prison guard watches cells, he locked them in a concrete underground cellar, soundproofed, sealed with a steel door hidden behind a closet, the kind of room that does not appear in any real estate listing. He had built this. He had planned this. The room did not exist by accident. Craig Shipper had looked at a future in which he needed to hold two people against their will, and he had prepared for it. The following afternoon, approximately 12 hours after the kidnapping, Craig drove the Van Ostens to the First Trust and Savings Bank in Albany, Illinois. He brought Ruth inside and told her what she was going to do. She was going to go to the teller window, and she was going to request a cashier's check for $350,000, made out to his LLC, to his business, the very business that bore his name, the business that was drowning in debt, the business he had been lying about for years. And if she did not comply, If she made any sign to anyone inside that bank that anything was wrong, he would kill Larry. Those were the terms. A woman in her 60s, terrified, bound by hours of fear and exhaustion and trauma, was being asked to walk into a bank and perform a transaction with absolute calm. Craig believed she would do it. He believed he had thought of everything. He had not. Ruth Van Osten was not just a frightened woman. She was a woman who, even in the most terrifying hours of her life, had not stopped thinking. She reached into her purse while she was at the teller window. She found a church flyer, a piece of paper from their own congregation, the very church where Craig sang hymns beside his wife on Sunday mornings. And on that flyer, with her hands that may have been shaking but her mind entirely clear, she wrote a note to the teller. She was in trouble. This was not a normal transaction. Please call the police. She slipped the note across the counter. The teller read it, and everything that Craig Shipper had spent years constructing began to come apart in a single afternoon. Back in Erie, Danielle is home with her children. It is an ordinary evening dinner, homework, the rhythms of a house that always has someone needing something. Craig is not home, but that is not unusual. Craig is often not home. She does not know where he is. She does not ask, because she has not asked for a long time, because the answers have always been reasonable and she has always accepted them. She does not know that at this moment, somewhere in Albany, Illinois, a bank teller is reading a note written on a church flyer by a terrified woman who was supposed to be home, asleep in her own bed 12 hours ago. She does not know that police are already moving, already following the name on the LLC, already drawing a line between the check and the business, and the man whose name appears on both. She does not know any of it. She is at home, being a mother, in the last ordinary evening of her life as she has known it. And then, a few nights later, Danielle is woken by a sound. It is loud and it is sudden and it does not belong to the quiet of a sleeping house. Before she can fully understand what is happening, there are police officers at her door. There are police officers in her yard. There are questions, urgent, serious questions, and the names, Larry and Ruth Van Osten, are being said in her home at a volume and with an urgency that strips the normalcy out of everything instantly. Where is your husband? When did you last see him? Do you know where he is tonight? Do you know a property in Geneseo? Do you know about a room? Danielle does not know. Danielle does not know any of it. And the officers looking at her face in that moment can see that. They can see a woman who is being told, in the language of police procedure and urgent questions, that the man she shared a life with has done something she cannot yet comprehend. Craig was found. The check had been made out to his LLC. His name led the police directly to him. There was a high-speed car chase, the financial advisor, the church member, the father of 6, driving away from everything at full speed in the dark of a February night in Illinois. The chase ended in a crash. Craig was taken into custody, and when police followed the trail he had left behind, they found Larry and Ruth Van Osten in the underground cellar of a property Craig owned in Geneseo, in a concrete room, in the dark, shackled, blindfolded, having been held captive for over 48 hours. They were alive. They were terrified and physically drained, but they were alive. And Connie's note, that handwritten plea on a church flyer in a woman's purse, was the only reason anyone found them when they did. When Craig was interrogated, he confessed. He told authorities that he had felt desperate, that he was trying to buy time to save his failing business. The full picture that emerged in the days and weeks after his arrest was almost incomprehensible in its scope. Craig had been allegedly embezzling from his own clients. He had been stealing money from family members. He had forged documents to borrow money against his parents' house, his own parents, who had trusted him the way parents trust their children, with the kind of trust that doesn't require paperwork. He had been constructing this elaborate financial fraud for years, layer by layer, while his wife raised their 6 children in the house above it and believed that everything was fine. Every closed door and late night and distracted evening had not been the behavior of a stressed businessman trying to provide for his family. It had been the behavior of a man trying desperately to keep his crimes from surfacing long enough to escape the consequences and the rental properties, those additions Craig had explained to Danielle as investments, as growth, as the signs of a man building something. They had included a room with a steel door hidden behind a closet, a soundproofed underground cellar with security cameras and a concrete floor. Craig Shipper had not just been hiding financial crimes. He had been preparing for the moment he might need to hold someone against their will. He had been thinking about this for long enough to build the infrastructure for it. That is the detail that changes everything, not the desperation of a man who panicked, but the calculation of a man who planned, who built, who prepared, who sat at the dinner table with his wife and his 6 children, and passed the evening in a normal way, and then went downstairs to his office and continued planning it. For Danielle Chauvet, the night the police came to her door was not simply the night her marriage ended. It was the night the entire architecture of her life, 17 years of it, 17 years of choices and sacrifices and early mornings and late evenings and faith and love and the daily commitment of raising a family, was revealed to have been built on something she never consented to and never knew. She said it herself, years later, in an interview that contained more quiet dignity than most people could have managed. I had a really hard time figuring out what reality was as opposed to what I thought reality was. That sentence is worth sitting with. Not what reality was, she said, what she thought reality was, because those two things had been entirely different for 17 years, and she had not known it. She had been living inside a story Craig was telling her, and Craig had been living inside a completely different story of his own. Divorcing Craig conflicted with Danielle's faith. She had stayed through things that would have sent other people leaving years earlier. She had stayed through the early confession, through the counselor's advice to leave, through the closed doors and the late nights, and the distance that grew between them like a slow frost. She had stayed because she believed in the commitment she had made. But there is a line, and Craig had crossed it in a direction so extreme that no amount of faith or commitment could construct a bridge back. Danielle knew that divorce was the only safe option for her and for her 6 children. She filed. Craig, from his jail cell, attempted to contact her, writing letters, and reportedly even pretending at one point to be a Southern woman in order to convince her to respond to him. She never responded. She has not spoken to him since the night of his arrest. In 2019, Craig was sentenced to 60 years in prison on charges of aggravated kidnapping, concealing identity, and home invasion. 60 years. He will be an old man before he is considered for release. Danielle's father, Tim, when asked about the sentence, used one word: glorious. Larry and Ruth Van Osten survived. They are the true center of what Craig's actions cost to people in their 60s who did nothing wrong, who were faithful members of a community that was supposed to protect them, who were dragged out of their home in the dark of a February morning and held in a concrete room beneath the ground for 48 hours by a man they had known from church. Their trauma does not disappear because Craig was sentenced. It does not vanish because justice was served. They carry it. They will always carry it. Ruth's quiet courage at that bank teller window, the note she wrote on a church flyer, with the calmness of a woman who had decided she was going to fight for her life and her husband's, is one of the most remarkable acts of composure under pressure you will ever hear about. She saved their lives. Without that note, without that teller, without the courage it took to write those words and slide them across the counter while her kidnapper waited outside, the story does not end the way it ended. And Grace, Craig and Danielle's oldest daughter, the teenager who wrapped the sledgehammer handle in black electrical tape because her father asked her to, who was told she'd receive a special treat for doing it, who had no idea, no possible idea, what she was helping to prepare. Grace has spoken about her mother in the years since everything happened. She said, "Our mom has grown so much. She's a stronger person, she's more confident. She laughs more now. I see so much happiness in her that I never saw before." Grace was describing a woman who had been freed, not from a marriage, but from the weight of living inside a lie she didn't know she was living inside. The laugh that Grace describes, the laugh that hadn't been there before, is what happens when the performance ends and a person gets to be real again. Danielle Chauvet rebuilt. She did not collapse, though she would have had every right to. She did not allow what Craig had done to become the permanent definition of who she was or what her children would become. She reconnected with her first love, a man named Billy, whom she had dated as a teenager, long before Craig, long before Erie and the financial advising business and the church pew and the closed office door and the February morning when everything broke open. She and Billy married. The family of 6 children, navigating an almost impossible emotional landscape, found their footing. They found their mother's laugh again, and in that, there is something that deserves to be said plainly. Surviving what Danielle survived, with 6 children depending on you, with your faith tested at its foundations, with the community you trusted, looking at you and wondering what you knew and when you knew it. That survival is not small. It is enormous. It is the kind of quiet, daily courage that does not make headlines, but that matters more than almost anything else in a story like this one. Craig Shipper is in a prison cell in Illinois. He is serving 60 years. The man who asked, through a voice distorter in a dark room, "Where's your God now?" That man is now somewhere that contains a very precise answer to his own question. He will grow old in there. And the community of Erie, and the family of Danielle Chauvet, and the survivors Larry and Ruth Van Osten, and the 6 children who grew up in a house that held secrets none of them deserved. They will continue their lives in the world outside. Here is what this story ultimately says. It says that the most dangerous deceptions are not the dramatic ones. They are not the ones that announce themselves. They are the ones that wear the clothing of ordinary life, the closed office door, the reasonable explanation, the calm voice that always has an answer, the church pew on Sunday morning. They are the ones that live inside the most trusted relationship you have, doing their damage in the hours you aren't watching, in the rooms you don't know exist. You cannot always detect them in advance. Danielle could not. Ruth Van Osten could not, until she was already in the concrete room. And that is the part of this story that should stay with you long after the screen goes dark. Not the sensational details, but the reminder that trust, which is one of the most human things we give each other, is also one of the most fragile, and the people most skilled at exploiting it are very often the ones who learned the earliest how to look like the very last person you'd ever suspect. What do you think? At what point in this story did you first feel that something was genuinely wrong with Craig? Drop your answer in the comments. Tell us the moment it hit you. And if someone in your life needs to hear a story like this one, share this video. Because sometimes, the most important thing you can do for someone you love is help them see what they might be too close to see on their own. We will see you in the next one.